My talk today about the figure of the collector is drawn from a much longer project from which much has been cut. So instead of offering a full portrait or history of collecting as we've inherited that idea, I've decided today to primarily focus on the account of collecting offered by Walter Benjamin and hopefully draw out some of the political consequences of that largely theoretical account. Though better known for collecting crumbling Latin manuscripts, Petrarch is also by tradition regarded as the first in a long line of coin collectors or numismatists. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Emily Dickinson both collected pressed flowers. Billionaire Walter Rothschild and novelist Vladimir Nabokov shared a passion for collecting butterflies. And Renaissance humanist Georgius Agricola and Gilded Age banker J.P. Morgan both collected minerals. Sigmund Freud could boast of an impressive, unsystematic collection of over 2,000 ancient artifacts, both real and fake, from Egypt, Greece, Rome, India, China, and Etruria. In her introduction to Walter Benjamin's Illuminations, Hannah Arendt makes the bold claim that collecting was Benjamin's central passion. Though he also collected picture postcards, toys, and scraps of paper, Arendt refers here to Benjamin's practice of book collecting. She appends this characterization, a short but poignant portrait of Benjamin in the throes of serious deliberations about whether or not to trade collected works of Kafka for an edition of Kafka's earlier writing, shortly before the fall of France to Nazi Germany, a seemingly absurd preoccupation given the dire political climate. Benjamin is very open about the autobiographical nature of his writings on the collector. In Unpacking My Library, he argues that the spirit of the bibliophile manifests itself not in the act of reading books, but rather through acquiring, collecting, arranging, and rearranging them. In fact, to actually read the books at hand would be contrary to the collector's values. For years, he writes, no book was allowed to enter my library without the certification that I had not read it, a surely hyperbolic claim that is at least to a degree supported by Arendt's own memory of the items he collected. In Benjamin's library, she writes, there were collections of rare children's books and of books by mentally deranged authors. Like many others among his treasures, not good for anything, serving neither to divert nor to instruct. Benjamin's model for understanding the relationship between the collector and the things of the collection pits a disinterested aesthetic appreciation of the thing itself against the functional utilitarian value which a book might otherwise serve, such as conveying meaning. He writes that, this is a long quote, what is decisive in collecting is that the object is detached from all its original functions in order to enter into the closest conceivable relation to things of the same kind. This relation is the diametric opposite of any utility and falls into the peculiar category of completeness. What is this completeness? It is a grand attempt to overcome the wholly irrational character of the object's mere present at hand through its integration into a new, expressly devised historical system, the collection. It is the deepest enchantment of the collector to enclose the particular item within a magic circle where, as the last shutter runs through it, the shutter of being acquired, it turns to stone. Attempting to sort the rubble of history into a single classifying system in the wake of the rupture of historical continuity inaugurated by modernity, Benjamin's collector must first attach the object from its functional relations, taking it like a holy relic or idol out of the spheres of use and commercial exchange. The magic circle of the collection is one in which objects are retired from the marketplace. The various functions and meanings which an item might acquire throughout its life of use are discarded, and the object begins its rebirth as a useless material thing. This rebirth is also, of course, a death, a passing from the everyday world in which the object is put to work and circulated for its utility or economic value, into the magical and final world in which the object submits to a terminal inertia characteristic of funerary goods or divine offerings, the fixed status of mere matter. The public collection par excellence, the museum, might be understood as one such magic circle outside of time into which objects retire from their originally variegated functions and contexts and become, collectively, things to be gazed upon rather than used. Anyone who's ever been to a house museum has seen the ubiquitous sign, please do not sit on the chairs. Jean Baudrillard writes that the act of collection submits a possessed object to an abstractive operation, the removal of a thing from any practical context and the ensuing loss of its precise identity. He writes, it ceases to be a carpet, a table, a compass, or a knickknack, and instead turns into an object or a piece. Those whose names now furnish our public museums, Whitney, Guggenheim, Frick, Carnegie, Getty, were of course all exorbitantly wealthy. Collecting, Arendt notes, is the passion of children for whom things are not yet commodities and are valued not according to their usefulness. And it is also the hobby of the rich who own enough not to need anything useful and hence can afford to make the transfiguration of objects their business, she writes. Here, she offers a corrective to Benjamin's glowing and frequently ironic assessment of collecting. The collector might liberate the artifact from the drudgery of utility and commercial exchange, but their ability to fetishize useless things is predicated upon their own freedom from the need to work, a particularly perverse display then of the luxurious privilege of uselessness. And indeed, two of the most commonly collected items, coins and stamps, the fossilized forms of economic value itself, demonstrate this independence from want and need all too flamboyantly. Benjamin, Arendt sardonically quips, was not yet aware of the fact that collecting can be an eminently sound and often highly profitable form of investment. Worse yet, she continues, upon closer examination, this whimsicality has some noteworthy and not so harmless peculiarities. There is, for one thing, the gesture, so significant in an era of public darkness, with which the collector not only withdraws from the public into the privacy of his four walls, but takes along with him all kinds of treasures that were once public property to decorate them. As she suggests here, the fussy antiquarian collector is indeed an unlikely candidate for the revolutionary potential that Benjamin nonetheless stakes a claim for in the Arcades project. The parallels between collecting and other forms of exploitative resource stockpiling are clear, and further, the collector had long occupied an inauspicious position in the public consciousness, hovering somewhere between eccentric and neurotic. Graver still, the collector's close cousin, the hoarder, who no longer attempts to select or discriminate between items, but rather accumulates matter as mass without order or category, occupies the plane of downright pathology. The figure of the hoarder would become crystallized in the American consciousness in the well-publicized image of the Collier brothers, whose legendary reclusiveness and the popular rumor that they guarded in their squalid Harlem home of great inherited wealth cast upon them unwanted celebrity in the 30s and 40s. In 1947, an anonymous call at the police, the Collier's home, where they found both brothers dead. One had been crushed to death by hundreds of pounds of debris after accidentally triggering one of the traps which he himself had devised in order to defend their home from the outside world. The police-led cleanup of the site became a media spectacle, drawing crowds of up to 2,000, and newspapers across the country kept a running tab of the building's contents as they were exposed to the light of day. Rather than finding stores of hidden wealth, what police found in the building was worthless. In fact, 103 tons of detritus, including 25,000 books and some knitting that their mother had left unfinished before dying 3 decades earlier. Theirs is perhaps still the definitive textbook case of compulsive hoarding. The lesser collector type was also a familiar figure to psychoanalysis, generally falling under the umbrella of anal retention. Baudrillard writes, the collector is subject to, quote, a powerful anal sadistic impulse that tends to confine beauty in order to savor it in isolation. The anal retentive figure of the collector is regressive for Baudrillard, both in that the psychic terrain of the collection provides a narcissistic retreat from the social and sexual relations that define correctly developed adulthood, but also because the mode of possession he or she practices is not just anti, but pre-social. Such a juvenile retentive practices as collecting are the modes of possession proper for Baudrillard to children and to mankind's own primitive state. Freud earlier connected the anal retentive patient who, to put it bluntly, right, collects fecal matter in their own person to another collector type, the miser. Money, Freud writes in The Wolfman, attracts onto itself the psychical interest which was originally proper to feces, the product of the anal zone. For Freud, the pleasurably, quote, masturbatory stimulus offered by, quote, the retention of feces provides a psychic blueprint upon which the miserly withdrawal of currency and other possessions from outside circulation might be mapped. The miser is, of course, an even older figure. In Capital Volume 1, Marx succinctly delineates the greedy miser who merely collects or hoards money or gold from the true capitalist who understands that the value of currency is representational and transactive. The miser therefore neglecting to make his money generative through investment. The miser is notably a pathetic figure for Marx, devoid even of the negative heroism of the capitalist. He forgoes life's pleasures in order to save money, but nonetheless is a failure even by the terms of the economic system, which he is unable to understand or read correctly. The miser, that is, fetishistically mistakes the sign of economic value, physical currency, for the actual value that it merely represents, or even the actual economic value. In his emphasis on miserliness as a form of misreading, Marx draws from the tropes of yet another closely related figure in the cultural genealogy of the collector, the idolator, who mistakes the sign of divinity for divinity itself. The process of idolatry, of forgetting that a statue or some other object is man-made and conferring upon it intrinsic, maybe divine, rather than symbolic value, is the blueprint for Marx's notion of the fetish character, but is also strikingly close to Benjamin's model of collection. In these related figures of the collector, the anal retentive, the miser, and the idolator, we see a closely entwined bundle of negative associations. All are pathetic, materialistic figures of error, waste, and impotence, united by a frantic relationship to lack or deprivation or the outside world, which is assuaged through an imminent, magical, and ultimately false logic of physical possession. What then is interesting or even useful, ironically, about the collector to Benjamin or to us? How might we view the collector other than as a caricature of the market logic of commodification? The archetypical collectors whom Arendt identifies are children who are taken care of and the rich who have the obscene privilege to waste rather than use resources. But Benjamin himself, in his account, does not emphasize the collector's class, but rather age. In the spirit of the collector, he writes, the childlike element combines with the element of old age. And in the Arcades project, he repeats that children, the elderly, particularly elderly men, and animals, such as birds and ants. Benjamin then places his model collector in an ambivalent, even marginal social position, emphasizing above all a difficult relationship to inheritance and social value. In prioritizing the useless and non-signifying over the useful and meaningful, the collector brings objects into the realm which they themselves already inhabit, too young and too old, respectively, to be productive, economically or sexually, to the ends of social production. This surprising alliance of the child and the elder gives us a glimpse, tenuous to be sure, of the periphery of capitalism's productive networks and to an alternative to the value-based systems of meaning designed to serve those networks. The story of the Collier brothers became a modern parable precisely because they so closely corresponded to the already familiar collector or hoarder profile to which Benjamin gestures. They were elderly, unemployed, childless bachelors, making the question of the fate of their resources particularly vexed, their inherited resources. The press took a savage glee in reports that children, strollers, and toys were found among the contents of their hoard. The childless Colliers were the final link in a lineage that could be traced back centuries, and the total value of their state was, in the end, negligible, functionally nothing, maybe even negative, considering they had to demolish the home. Rather than hiding away from a changing world in oriental splendor, as the New York Times had speculated, they were in fact all but destitute, guarding the beloved things, worthless in financial terms, of a family history of which they would be the queer dead end. Severed from the future, the elderly collector is a terminal heir of inheritance, a value to nobody, or a value to nobody for whom value is future-facing. The Colliers, I think, represent a form of collecting very different than Arendt's profit-minded antiques vendor, a description, Arendt's, which in fact matches Benjamin's father very well, who was an antiques vendor, but not necessarily Benjamin himself, whose literary collection was of almost entirely personal and esoteric value, pursued against, most often, his best market interests. The investor hoards up resources not for pleasure, but for future profit, as in the biblical parable of Joseph and the hoarding of the grain in Egypt, which provided spiritual authorization for the mercantilist projects of the early modern world system by legitimizing investment as a form of use. But the sorts of books and other objects which Benjamin collected were not valuable public resources withdrawn from public need, but rather cultural detritus, the stuff of secondhand shops and perhaps garbage bins, their continued existence hardly justified by use or exchange value, but rather contingent upon a private system of value which eschews these priorities. To the collector, Benjamin writes, this is a quote, falls the Sisyphean task of divesting things of their commodity character by taking possession of them, but he bestows on them only a connoisseur value rather than use value. In valuing the thing in itself rather than for what it does or symbolizes, the collector practices a form of fetishism, which Benjamin suggests is resistant to rather than a caricature of the logic of commodification, a logic which in contrast evacuates the thing itself of all but exchange value. Nostalgically preserving the dusty relics of the cherished past, the collector's interest in the bygone world proves to be nonetheless generatively self-defeating. Plucking the artifact from its original temporal, spatial, and functional relations, the collector, the intended heir and preserver, as Arendt puts it, again, unexpectedly turns into a destroyer by defacing, this is her quote, the context in which his object was once only part of a greater living entity. In this transformation into a piece, then, the collector effaces the meaning or spirit of history while preserving its material, like a hobbyist pinning down butterflies, and thus forces us to find new and novel ways of understanding a past that has been reduced to the non-meaning rubble of its remains, the stone graveyard of history. The magic circle, the space outside of history and purpose, is a plane of stone in which familiar objects become statues of themselves, tautologies, unchanging and static. The fetishizing logic of the collection then requires a particular magical fantasy of atemporality, that the object was always, as it is now, alienated from the causal structures of temporal emergence and change. This is why Adorno will write that Benjamin sort of paradoxically celebrates a certain kind of reification against reification. If Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history would lambast a universalizing historicism that imagines human history as moving forward progressively through the static chamber of time, then the collector reverses this process with a Medusan glance, to use Adorno's term, locking onto a petrified object as time moves around it. Crucially, the systematizing dilemma of the modern collector is also for Benjamin the central concern of the men of the Baroque, who had access to a historically unprecedented mass of art objects around the world and throughout the annals of time. No longer could anyone speak of a history. In the new global framework of the Baroque world, history became histories, often competing and irreconcilable histories. This is a really common feature of theoretical accounts of the Baroque, that neoclassical tried to revive antiquity, Baroque antiquities. The encyclopedia, a collection of concepts, much like our conference, was one historical response to this dilemma. As in other collections, the encyclopedia, aiming at something like completion, brings disparate things together proximally under the arbitrary order of the alphabet without arranging them into a unified and certainly not progressive narrative. Ultimately, it is children who serve as Benjamin's primary model for the value of collecting, as a mere consequence of their necessary disloyalty, both to the adult world of work and profit, but also to a past that is out of their reach. They are, he writes in One Way Street, this is a slightly long quote, irresistibly drawn by detritus. In waste products, they recognize the face of the world of things that turns directly and solely to them. In using these things, they do not so much imitate the work of adults as bring together in the artifact produced in play, materials of widely differing kinds in a new intuitive relationship. Children thus produce their own small world of things within the greater one. Children can experience phenomenon only as novelty, and as such cannot help but pay attention to the things of the world that fall beneath or outside of the gaze of the adult realm, into which a thing is coterminous with its use or exchange value and hardly warrants attention in itself, even when useful. They have not yet learned, in other words, that detritus and waste are beneath notice. For Benjamin, then, the figure of the child collector, and this really is a figure rather than some child we should all be imitating, shows us one way of paying attention to things which escape notice, of caring for that which is of no obvious use, of devising systems of value which exist outside of market relations, of drawing up new, playful, and surprising relationships between things, of rejecting the logic of idolatry or the fetish, which too quickly presumes that the object is not in fact divine, the unproductive pleasure in fact false, and of carving out, at least temporarily, small worlds within the larger one, worlds which, if nothing else, remind us that other worlds, and stranger yet other pasts, are possible. Thank you.